$1.75 trillion. That is the estimated private valuation of a company that, in 2008, had exactly one rocket, and it had just exploded on the launch pad for the third time in a row. The man who founded it had invested his entire personal fortune into it. He was broke. He had weeks of operating capital left, and he had publicly told his engineers that if this next launch failed, the company was finished. It didn't fail. And what Elon Musk built from that moment is no longer just a company. It is the most consequential military infrastructure provider on Earth, the operator of more active satellites than every other nation and organization combined, the only private entity that has ever docked a spacecraft to the International Space Station and then sent an invoice. Stay until Chapter 5, because the $1.75 trillion valuation is not the most alarming number in this story. The percentage of global internet infrastructure SpaceX now controls is. Governments that once competed to reach space now write checks to a private company just to get their astronauts home. This is how that happened. And this is why nobody, not the United States government, not the European Union, not China, can fully control what comes next. The company that should not exist, SpaceX, failed 3 consecutive orbital launches, burned through almost all of its capital, and survived by approximately 2 weeks of financial runway. Today, it launches more rockets per year than any nation on Earth. In 2002, every credible aerospace engineer told Elon Musk the same thing. Building a private rocket company from scratch was not a viable business. The rocket industry was dominated by Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and their joint venture, United Launch Alliance, a government-backed duopoly that had effectively locked private competition out of launch contracts for decades. NASA's own cost per kilogram to orbit was approximately $54,000. Nobody had meaningfully changed that number in 30 years. Musk thought the number was wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. He spent 6 months reading every aerospace textbook he could find, then flew to Russia to try to purchase decommissioned intercontinental ballistic missiles to repurpose as launch vehicles. The Russians laughed at him, literally at the meeting. He flew home, opened a spreadsheet, and calculated that if you built the rockets yourself from raw materials rather than purchasing them through the existing aerospace supply chain, the cost dropped by a factor of 10. He founded SpaceX in 2002 with $100 million of his PayPal acquisition money. Within 6 years, he had spent almost all of it and had 3 consecutive failed launches to show for it. On August 3, 2008, the Falcon 1 rocket, SpaceX's first orbital launch vehicle, lifted off from Amulek Island in the Pacific for its 4th attempt. Inside SpaceX's Hawthorne, California headquarters, the entire company watched on monitors. If this failed, there would be no 5th attempt. Musk had already told his senior team privately that the company had enough money for one more launch and approximately 2 months of payroll after that. The rocket reached orbit. Engineers who had not slept in 36 hours cried at their workstations. That same year, 2008, SpaceX won a $1.6 billion NASA contract to resupply the International Space Station. The company that had just barely survived its 4th launch attempt had, in the span of 4 months, gone from near bankruptcy to holding the largest commercial launch contract in NASA history. The aerospace industry spent 30 years making orbital launches expensive. It took one man with a spreadsheet and a tolerance for failure to prove they had been wrong the entire time. The reusable rocket that changed everything. SpaceX's development of reusable rocket boosters reduced the cost of reaching orbit by over 80%, and in doing so, made the entire global launch industry economically obsolete overnight. For 60 years, every rocket booster ever launched was a single-use vehicle. It lifted off, separated, and fell into the ocean. Building a new one for the next launch cost tens of millions of dollars. This was considered a fixed cost of spaceflight, as fundamental as gravity itself. No government program, no private competitor, and no aerospace engineer with a conventional career had seriously proposed changing it. Musk proposed changing it in 2011. His engineers told him it would take 10 years. He told them they had 5. The program was called Falcon 9. And its core innovation was a booster that, after separating from the upper stage, could reignite its engines. navigate back to a landing zone, and touch down vertically on deployable landing legs, a maneuver that had never been successfully completed in the history of rocketry. It failed repeatedly, publicly, on video. Each failed landing was streamed live. On December 21, 2015, a Falcon 9 first-stage booster separated from its upper stage at an altitude of approximately 70 kilometers, reoriented itself, reignited 3 of its 9 Merlin engines, and descended toward Cape Canaveral Landing Zone 1. The landing legs deployed, the booster slowed, and it touched down softly, precisely, and completely intact, to a crowd reaction at SpaceX headquarters that sounded less like an engineering milestone and more like a championship game. The aerospace industry's response was, initially, skepticism. The booster had landed, yes, but would it fly again? Could it? It flew again, and again. One Falcon 9 booster has now flown over 20 times. United Launch Alliance, the Boeing-Lockheed duopoly that had controlled U.S. government launch contracts for decades, responded to SpaceX's reusable rocket by announcing a next-generation rocket program of their own. As of the time of this video, that rocket has not yet reached orbit. SpaceX's Falcon 9, meanwhile, has completed over 250 successful launches. When you change the economics of an industry, the incumbents don't adapt. They announce programs. There is a difference. Starlink and the accidental internet empire SpaceX's Starlink satellite constellation now operates over 6,000 active satellites, more than every other operator on Earth combined, and provides internet access to over 100 countries. It was supposed to be a side project to fund Mars. It became a geopolitical asset that reshaped a war. When Musk announced Starlink in 2015, the reaction from the telecommunications industry was polite dismissal. Satellite internet had been tried before. The latency was terrible. The cost was prohibitive. The coverage was inconsistent. The established players, traditional telecom companies, had spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars building ground-based infrastructure. A constellation of small satellites launched by a private rocket company was not going to disrupt that. Starlink's technical approach was different from every previous satellite internet attempt. Instead of a small number of large satellites in high orbit, which created the latency problem, SpaceX deployed thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit, reducing signal travel time to levels competitive with ground-based broadband. The cost advantage was decisive. SpaceX could launch its own satellites on its own rockets at its own marginal cost. No competitor could replicate that vertical integration. By 2023, Starlink had over 2 million subscribers across 160 nations. In February 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine. Within 72 hours, Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Mikhailo Fedorov sent a public tweet directly to Elon Musk asking for Starlink terminals. Musk activated Starlink coverage over Ukraine and began shipping terminals within days. When Russian forces targeted Ukrainian communications infrastructure in the opening weeks of the war, Ukrainian military units maintained battlefield connectivity through Starlink. Military analysts described it as a decisive tactical advantage in the conflict's early phase. A private satellite internet company, run by one person, had provided military-grade communications infrastructure to a nation at war faster than any government could have mobilized the equivalent capability. The same capability that helped Ukraine also created the first documented case of a private individual making unilateral decisions about military communications in an active war zone. Musk later acknowledged that he had personally intervened to restrict Starlink service in certain operational areas of the conflict, a decision that affected battlefield operations. No elected official, no military commander, and no international body had authority over that decision. One person, one company, one call. A private citizen made a unilateral decision that affected military operations in an active war with no oversight, no vote, and no appeal. Do you think that kind of power should exist outside of government? Drop your verdict in the comments. When you control the infrastructure, you control the terms. Every time. The government that became a customer, NASA, The agency that put humans on the moon now pays SpaceX to transport its astronauts to the International Space Station. The United States military pays SpaceX to launch its most classified satellites. The most powerful government on Earth is, functionally, a recurring client. For 40 years, the relationship between the U.S. government and the aerospace industry operated in one direction. The government funded development, set requirements, and owned the results. Companies like Boeing and Lockheed built what they were told, charged what they needed, and delivered on government timelines, which were, reliably, late and over budget. SpaceX inverted that model entirely. When NASA retired the space shuttle in 2011, the United States had no domestic capability to launch astronauts to the International Space Station. For 9 years, American astronauts rode Russian Soyuz capsules to reach the station at a cost of approximately $90 million per seat. SpaceX's Crew Dragon capsule changed that in 2020, when it carried NASA astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken to the ISS on a vehicle designed, built, and operated entirely by a private company. The launch cost NASA approximately $55 million per seat, 40% less than the Russian alternative. In the post-launch press conference, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine described the moment as a new era in human spaceflight. What he did not say, but every aerospace analyst understood, was that NASA had just ceded operational control of its human spaceflight program to a vendor. A brilliant, reliable, cost-effective vendor, but a vendor nonetheless. SpaceX's launch manifest is now so full that NASA missions compete for scheduling priority alongside commercial satellites, private crewed missions, and Starlink deployments. The agency that once defined the American space program now books launch windows in advance, like any other customer. The fastest way to become indispensable to a government is to solve a problem it cannot solve itself, and then become the only one who can. The number nobody can regulate. SpaceX controls more than 50% of all active satellites currently in orbit. No international body, no national government, and no regulatory framework was designed to handle that concentration of orbital infrastructure in private hands. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the foundational international law governing activity beyond Earth's atmosphere, was written when spaceflight was the exclusive domain of nation-states. It assumes that the entities launching objects into space are governments, accountable to other governments through diplomatic channels. SpaceX is not a government. It is not publicly traded. It has no shareholders to answer to, no quarterly earnings calls to manage, and no board with the authority to override its founder. It is, structurally, one of the least accountable entities ever to acquire strategic global infrastructure. Starlink's constellation expansion continues at a rate that regulators cannot match. The FCC, the U.S. regulatory body with authority over satellite communications, has approved SpaceX's applications for tens of thousands of additional satellites. The ITU, the international body that manages orbital frequency allocation, operates on timelines measured in years. SpaceX operates on timelines measured in weeks. By the time any regulatory response is formulated, the infrastructure it is responding to has already been deployed, activated, and integrated into the communications architecture of over 100 countries. In 2021, China filed a formal complaint with the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, stating that Chinese space station Tiangong had been forced to execute emergency avoidance maneuvers on 2 separate occasions to avoid collision with Starlink satellites. The complaint described the situation as a threat to the safety of Chinese astronauts and requested that the UN intervene to impose regulatory constraints on SpaceX's constellation. The unacknowledged receipt of the complaint. No enforceable action followed. If you build the infrastructure before the regulations exist, you do not operate inside the rules. You become the reason the rules need to be rewritten. Here is what $1.75 trillion buys when you build it from a single launch pad on a Pacific island in 2008. More than 50% of all satellites in orbit. Internet infrastructure that shaped the outcome of a European land war. A NASA that books launch windows like any other customer. And the regulatory environment that is, by every honest assessment, running approximately 10 years behind the reality it is supposed to govern. At the beginning of this video, $1.75 trillion sounded like the number of a company. By now it sounds like the budget of a nation. Because SpaceX is not competing with other companies anymore. It is competing with governments. And in every category that matters, cost, speed, capability, and scale, it is winning. Here is the reversal that changes everything you just heard. Elon Musk has said, repeatedly and publicly, that SpaceX's purpose is not to dominate Earth's orbital economy. It is to make humanity multiplanetary. The satellites, the government contracts, the $1.75 trillion valuation, these are, in his framing, the means to an end. The end is Mars, which raises the only question that actually matters at the scale of this story. What happens when the most powerful infrastructure operator in the history of spaceflight decides that Earth is not the priority anymore? Be honest with yourself. Do you think any government is ready for that answer? Next video. The family that quietly controls more of what you eat, wear, and drive than any company you have ever heard of, and has done it for over 100 years without anyone noticing. Subscribe. It drops this week. See you in the next one.